Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm so excited to have you on talking about your project. Why don't you just go ahead and let the audience know your name, pronouns, and any identities that you would like to share?
Yeah, my name is Eliot Anderberg. My pronouns are they, them.
Wonderful. So to start us off, I actually have a little icebreaker, um, just to kind of get the questions rolling, I guess. So I'm gonna ask, who is your favorite musician?
It's hard. That's a very hard question. On Monday I went to go see an Indigo D'Souza concert, so she is on my mind. It was really good. It's probably either her or Waxahachie, I'd say,
Mm,
or like Charlie XCX.
love that. I'm sure, like the comments, you'll see a lot of them being like, "Oh, I love them too." Those are some good ones. Um, my favorite, I really love 21 Pilots. I never got out of my emo phase,
Mm,
and
sure.
I'm still stuck loving them so much. Um, yeah, shout out to them.
I had that phase.
I think a lot of people in our community had that phase. And a lot of us are like me, still stuck in it. That was actually my senior superlative was most likely for emo face to not be a face. It's like,
That's
wow,
funny.
thanks guys. That's the whole personality that you give me. All right, so let's talk about Euphoria Quilts. You created this project. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So the Euphoria Quilt project is a group quilt project. If you are unfamiliar, a group quilt is when different parts or squares of a quilt are made by different people or different groups and then sent to one person usually and then joined together to create one final product. The most famous example of a group quilt is the AIDS Memorial Quilt. But group quilts are kind of like as old as quilts themselves. Um, the project asked people to send in blocks that in some way, like big or small, express or explore their own gender expansive joy. So the quilt is going to be made up of over 140 blocks. It's going to be 11 feet by 12 feet. As long as I can pull it off, it's going to be one big quilt. There's an off chance it'll be two quilts, but I think I'm going to do it. Yeah, so it's going to be one big expression of gender expansive joy is the goal.
So that would be like big enough to cover two full like king size mattresses next to each other.
Yes.
That's massive. You could like wrap yourself in a burrito in it with like 10 other people.
Yes.
It's insane. Where did this idea to like pursue gender expansive identities through the medium of quilting come from?
So, I mean, the simplest answer is like because I'm a quilter. So it was the medium I wanted to use. But there's actually like a few much deeper um, reasons as well. The first is that quilts, because they're such large undertakings, like it's always been a very community oriented art form. So that felt apt. Um, and the other reason is that I really like the quilt as like a metaphor. It was really important to me, like obviously because the quilt is going to be 11 by 12, it's like not going to be functional in a way as a quilt because it'll be too big, but it was really important to me that the quilt be a fully functional quilt. And that's because like what quilts represent. You know, they're things that bring us comfort. They're blankets at the end of the day, right? So they bring us comfort. They're often like made because, like I said, they take so long. They're made with tons and tons of care and intention. And the final biggest reason why quilts is that my favorite way to think about quilts is to think of them as archives. Um, there's something about quilts where they're just really sturdy and they last a really long time. You know, like some of us might own quilts made by, I have quilts made by my great, great, and great, great, great grandmothers that are over 100 years old and like they look like they were made yesterday, even though they've been in
Wow.
use for 100 years. Um, and so in that way, you know, they last a really long time. They take so long to make, so they like live with you while you're making them. I really like like I said, I really like thinking about quilts as archives. And so for me, I want the Euphoria quilt to be an archive and to like mark this time that we're in and hopefully be something that in the future people can look at and see like what in some small way, like what we were up to during this time. Um, yeah, attached to that, there is going to be right now, we're working on building an online archive of all of the blocks. So the quilt
Oh,
itself will be an archive, but there will also be a separate archive as well of all the blocks that are in it.
I love that. That's really cool. I I can't help but think, like as an art historian, it would be really cool to even like try to get something like that printed, like have a book that kind of shows all of the quilt pieces. Is that something you've thought of or that you'd be interested in?
I mean, it's something I would definitely be interested in. Yeah. Um,
Would love to help with that if you really want to. I would love
that
to
would
help
be
with that.
cool.
I've published books before. I think that would be fun.
I mean,
And
that would be amazing. Yeah.
yeah, let's see what we can do with that.
Okay.
Definitely. I think that's really cool. It's There's something about an online archive that is so important because it's super accessible. But like as a historian, I'm thinking like the way that we gather information as historians is mostly through books or like papers, like documents. And so you want people in 100 years to know that this project existed and what it did for the community. Having a book, like a physical thing that people can find or look for in libraries, that could have some permanence to it, which is again goes back to the idea of quilts lasting kind of a very long time. um, Having like another way for it to have a permanent location in the world would be really cool. I think that'd be
Yeah.
fun.
Me
So, what
too.
was the process? What was the process from when you started to ask for submissions to like final product?
So the first step was the first thing that I had to like think about and decide was who I wanted to have contribute to the quilt. At first, the it was going to be about like trans joy instead of gender expansive joy, and like I was butch before I was trans. I mean, I'm still butch. And so I'm like always very aware that there are communities that aren't necessarily trans, but experience a lot of the same feelings and like a lot of the same treatment and reactions from the world as trans people. So it became kind of slippery really fast to think about only trans people contributing to the quilt. And then I had this moment where I realized that there might be opportunity to make the project like a solidarity building project. And so the submissions were open to not just queer and trans people who identify as gender nonconforming, but also specifically for any queer person, even if they consider themselves cis or gender conforming, I guess. Um, and that was because I wanted to create um, a project that would encourage like queer people to think about the ways that to be queer is to be gender nonconforming, because I really think that that's true. Um, so once I had that concept settled on, I put out a call just on Instagram um, for submissions, and I learned very quickly that quilters are very enthusiastic people, as are queer people. So it became pretty easy to spread the word. And I, yeah, then I collected blocks for about 6 months, all in all. And then the next step was to assemble, or is to assemble the quilt, which is the step that I'm in the middle of right now. Once I'm done assembling the what's called the quilt top, which is the part of the quilt that you see, it's the part with the design. The next step of the process of quilting is the part of the process that is we actually call quilting. And that is where, so like a quilt is made of 3 layers, and those 3 layers are joined together with a lot of tiny little stitches. And that is the part of the process that makes quilts so sturdy. So
Mhm.
it's important to me that the quilt is quilted. Um, and so the next step of the process is going to be that part, which I really want to do in community. That's the part of the process that historically has made quilting a community oriented art form, because it's the most labor intensive part of the process. You can do it on a sewing machine or you can do it by hand. Historically, it was done by hand, and my plan is to quilt the Euphoria quilt by hand. So my dream slash plan is to take the quilt on the road and hold events where I have people come and we hand quilt it together. So that is the next step of the process, which will probably start this summer.
Wow, that's really cool. I took um I took a quilting class when I was a teenager, and it was a really interesting class. We spent like the majority of it actually just cutting out the shapes because we did like it was like 9 blocks of cherries. And I remember we got to the part where it was supposed to be quilting, and we only had like I want to say like 2 weeks left of the class, and it's like 1 hour each week. And they were like, "This isn't gonna get done if we don't just do it for you because you're like 10-year old." So we like came back the last week and they were just like completely done after we had like spent the entire class just cutting out shapes. So I didn't get that experience of like the actual like quilting part. So that was cool to learn about that. I didn't know much about it. I think there's something really cool about having those community art projects where you all kind of contribute a little bit to it. It makes it even more like special when you have the final product and you're like, look what we did. It's a little
Yeah,
bit different than
totally.
look what I did when you finish an art project. Um, Completely different feeling. Um,
Yeah, that's the goal.
Absolutely. So speaking of goals, what do you hope that like participators participants will have gained from the experience?
Yeah, so I created some guiding questions that were like optional for people who were making blocks. And my personal favorite of them was gender is a place where words often fail us. What can a visual medium offer you that words can't?
Mm,
And that was something that was like important to me that people explore. I know that like I mean, I personally really relate to that, that words don't suffice when it comes to my gender. And it's not that words were prohibited to use in the quilt. There are some blocks that use words, but almost all of them don't. And I hope that people who made blocks like learned a little something about themselves, or just had a joyful experience making their blocks. Um, the reason that I chose joy, like joy is the central tenet of the project, is because I think that queer and trans people have a really special and really unique relationship to joy, and we always have. Queer art, like throughout history, has so often been about joy. And in my own work, that's something that I explore a lot. And I have a lot of questions about why that is. Like, I think inherently there's something inherent that we all kind of understand, but it's hard to put into words.
Yeah,
And so I hope that it was an experience that made people reflect on that and think about the fact that I think as queer and trans people, joy is kind of our birthright. And yeah, it's something that we inherently understand in a way that's really special.
I completely agree. It is it is so different, I think, than the cis experience with gender, and it allows us to be super creative in that way. And that's not to say that there aren't cis people who are doing amazing creative projects in relationship with their, gender identity. I think it's just a lot more prevalent in our gender expansive community because that is something that is, attacked and also like such an innate part of us, something that we have to find and that it's not well represented always in society. I think all those things contribute to why it's such an important part of our community to be creative. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
absolutely. So do you enjoy the process of sorting and sewing all of them? I know like you're a quilter, you know, even before this you were a quilter, obviously. And so, most people don't do things like that as a hobby or for work or anything if they don't find it fun. But this is a whole different beast. You've got 11 by 12 feet to sort out and sew together. And, you're planning this road trip that you just mentioned. Are you enjoying like the process of making it, or is it kind of getting a little tedious?
I am enjoying it. I worried that it was going to be tedious, and it was kind of this behemoth that was down the line ahead of me, and I like worried that it was just going to be tedious. And quilting is always tedious. Um,
Yeah.
you have to find the kind of tediousness that you enjoy. There are a lot of different ways to quilt, and I think the thing that has surprised me, um, pleasantly surprised me, that I've realized while sewing the quilt together is that it's felt really powerful to like a lot of the blocks have been in storage for a really long time. I got my first blocks in like I think July of 2023, and I just started sewing them together last month. And so I've had a lot of them in storage for a long time. And there's something about sewing them together that like feels like it's really like reactivating them and reactivating all the intentions that they were made with. And that has felt really special. And so many of them were made with so much care, and it really is like it's such an honor to have so many of them in front of me and be trusted with all of these feelings and all these intentions. And yeah, that has been like such a joy.
Mm, yeah, when you put it like that, I mean, I'm not a quilter. I would find that process personally to be very time consuming, and I'm like an instant gratification artist. I like to like sit down, do it, and complete it in one sitting, and that would be so. I mean, I have a quilt on my bed that I made. I got so tired. I was hand stitching the whole thing, and I got so tired of it that I just used liquid stitch to stick it to the backing. And I was like, That's it. That's all I'm doing because it sat in my closet for, I want to say like 3 or 4 years unfinished. And I was like, you know what? If this is how it gets finished, I'm okay with that. Um, yeah. So for
But you
me,
finished it.
yeah,
So
I did.
like, yeah.
I did. It's not perfect. It's not even close to good, but it's, it's finished. But yeah, I can imagine just the care and the intention that went into the blocks. Like I can see how that would be like rejuvenating. It's like every time you pull out a new one and you get to look at it, it's almost like opening a present or something. Like you get to see something entirely new that someone else like trusted you with, like you said. And I think that would be the thing that would keep me going with that as well. Um, just kind of having something new to look at and something interesting to kind of like, and not only that, but it's another person's like item. So you're like, okay, I have to take special care of this. I have to like see this out because all of these people, you know, have sent me these things and it's important to them. And so therefore it must be also important to me in this way. So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, I totally see why that would be less tedious that way. Yeah. So do you plan to do more in the future, or is this kind of like a one-time project?
Well, that question is hard to answer because it's going to take me a long time to finish this thing.
True.
Like, I'm probably years away, realistically. So we will see, is kind of my answer. I'm going to be living with this thing for like a long time. And I'm excited about that fact. When I started the project, I purposefully didn't. Sometimes people like ask me or have asked me towards the beginning of the project, like, what's your end goal? Like, where do you want it to end up? And I purposefully didn't have an answer to that question because I wanted the project to be able to grow
Mm,
um, as it went. And I knew it was going to take so long. And I think that has been a blessing because when the project started, I never thought I was going to get over 140 blocks. I was going to be happy getting like 12. Um, so, yeah, it's been really cool to see the project grow, and I want to give it space to continue to grow. Um,
mm.
so, I
I
don't
love
know.
I was
Yeah,
gonna ask that as well, if you knew where it was gonna end up. So we'll see, we'll see.
we'll
I
see.
like that answer. We'll see. As you're going through the squares, have any in particular like really stood out to you as like, wow, these are like just beautiful?
Definitely, yes. Um, I think the thing that has stood out to me is like there are definitely themes within the blocks. So I would say that the biggest theme is almost all the blocks that I've gotten have been improvised, which means like when they set out to start the project, I have an example. So like one way you can quilt is you can like have a design that like looks like this and plan to make a block that looks like this. Or you can start out not knowing what it's going to look like and just start sewing pieces of fabric together in ways that you like the way it looks. And I think that the most common like note that I've gotten along with submissions has said something along the lines of like, I started this with a plan, but it didn't work out. So then I just threw the plan out the window and followed my intuition. And like usually those notes then also have at the end, like say something like, and that felt like an appropriate metaphor for my gender, um,
Mhm.
which I personally really relate to.
Oh, I love
um, so that's like the biggest theme through them all that I've noticed and has really stood out to me. Another one is a lot of people have used like fabric that's really special to them. A lot of people using fabric that was like passed on to them by like their grandmother or great grandmother or like chosen family elders. And a lot of the notes that have come with those have said something along the lines of like, I never got to come out to this person, or I chose not to. So like making this block with this material that I got from them like felt like a really wonderful way to commune with them, which have been some of my favorite notes. Um, yeah, a lot of pink, a lot of bright colors. Pink is my favorite color, so I've loved the amount of pink that
I love
I've
that.
seen. Um, but those are the things that have like really stood out to me.
Mm, that's really cool. I love that you mentioned that like one of the ways to make a block is to just kind of put pieces together and see how they come out. I really like that. I am a collage artist myself, and so that's exactly what we do as collage artists. And I never thought about making a quilt that way or even like sewing that way. Um, I always kind of thought, oh, you've got, a pattern or you've got like your set way of doing things kind of it seemed very methodical. And I think that's one thing I that kind of kept me away from that type of like craft was I didn't like how strict it seemed.
Mhm.
It never really occurred to me that it doesn't have to be so strict. And so that's a really cool thing that I may explore again. You're inspiring me to maybe want to sew again.
Good. I'm glad. No, there's a lot of overlap, I think, between collage and quilts. I'm in an art history class right now in school where we're studying some collage artists, and all the readings I keep being like, that's just like quilting, or like that's just like the way I do quilting, at least. It's not the way everybody does it, but yeah.
You mentioned before that there were a lot of different ways to quilt. What are some of the ones that you use? Or if you only have one, is it the collage type?
Yeah, I only make improvisational.
Mm,
Sometimes I'll have a plan of like what it's gonna look like, but for the most part, I find that too tedious. Um, when you're making something, like I do relate to wanting the instant gratification piece, and like when you set out to make something where you know what it's going to look like before you start, and then you have to execute that, I get bored.
mhm,
And when you make things the way where you just start sewing pieces together and then cutting them up and rearranging them, then you always surprise yourself with what it looks like. And um, yeah, it makes the process really fun, and that's kind of the only way I do it.
I love it. I think I'm definitely gonna see what I can do. I have some fabric. I have a hand sewing machine. We'll see. See what happens. Last question because we're running on time. What would you say to the beginner who may want to get into quilting?
I think that the one thing that I will say is that if you can sew a line with a straight stitch on a sewing machine, like the most basic line, it doesn't even have to be straight, then like you can quilt. And I've taught so many people who previously didn't know how to use a sewing machine to like make a quilt block in the span of a couple of hours. It's intimidating because like there are so many steps to the process, but it's actually not difficult, especially if you
Mm.
aren't quilting. It is difficult to make things that look like this. So don't do that if you're a beginner, would be my recommendation. Um, I really like to look at another recommendation that I would have for beginners is to look at other improvised or kind of like wonky, and I don't mean that in a bad way, quilts. The best example of that is there's a really famous quilting community in Alabama that's called Gee's Bend. It's spelled Gee and then bend. And I would recommend Google image searching their quilts. It really like shows you that things that are wonky are beautiful and that you don't need to be exact to make a beautiful quilt.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, that would be my recommendation. Whenever I teach quilting, I always bring my book of G-Bend quilts and show them to people, to my students who are beginners, to show them that like they don't need to be able to sew straight lines or even make a perfectly square quilt to make something that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's another overlap with collage. It, it's not going to look perfect because you can't make it look perfect. And I think that's part of the beauty of it. I love teaching people that art does not need to be like aesthetically pleasing to be good art.
Hmm.
Um, it's is a very important part of my soul to make sure that anybody who wants to create art isn't stopped by their like fear of it not looking beautiful to everyone else. Like that is not the point of art.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're at time. I want to make sure people can find you and your project so that they can follow along. Where can the audience find you?
You can find me on Instagram. The Our username is just at Euphoria Quilt. I'm also on Substack. If you just Google search Euphoria Quilt Project Substack, I will pop up, or we will pop up. Um, yeah, those are the two places that it's best to find us.
Yay. I think the Substack is also in their Instagram bio if
It's,
anyone in the audience also wants to find it that way, if that makes it easier. Well, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so happy that you decided to come on today and tell us a little bit about quilting and about your project and kind of how that's been going. Um, we're just really thrilled to get to talk to you today. So thank you so much.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Right. Bye.
Bye.